トビデオ
I've done quite a few videos where the subject has been centered on Osamu Tezuka or someone who has been in his sphere of influence. 3 years ago, I did a video on Blackjack the Movie, a noir medical drama built to put one of Tezuka's most enduring characters on the big screen. At the start of this year, I covered Metropolis, an adaptation of one of Tezuka's earliest manga turned into a full-scale loving tribute of the man's entire body of work. Both were excellent films that did their job of honoring the artist who was instrumental in making both manga and anime the cornerstone of their respective global mediums. They had to be, considering they were done by two of Tezuka's most successful students, Osamu Dezaki and Rentaro. But therein lies the problem. I've talked about films that are meant to be posthumous memorials to Tezuka. I have not talked about any of the films Tezuka was involved in when he was alive. Stating the obvious here, but it's one thing to talk about the films Tezuka influenced when he was dead. It's a whole nother ballgame to talk about the films he was directly involved with in life. So easy it is to get caught up in his legacy and how he influenced works from other creators that it is super easy to overlook talking about his own craft work, how he operates as a writer and artist. Today's subject is hopefully going to remedy that a little. While Tezuka really only worked on it in a supervisor position, he did originate the story and did guide a lot of the principal players in the film's overall direction. A long time ago, a mother unicorn had a litter of baby unicorns. One of these babies is born with a white horn and the special gift to make people everywhere happy. The little baby's name is Unico.
君の名前はユニコ、それしかわからない。白い角のユニコ、寂しがり屋の。
However, Unico's ability to make everyone happy makes the gods up in heaven really unhappy. They have a very Republican belief that happiness should only come to those who deserve it, and if people are happy all the time, they will stop worshipping them. So they command the West Wind to take this literal child from his family and exile him to the hills of oblivion.
間の流れを下って行き、忘却の丘の果てへ捨ててくるのじゃ。さすれば、もうユニコは誰の目にも触れることはないであろう。
承知いたしました。
But the West Wind ultimately takes pity on the poor little pony and decides to drop him off in various locations where she thinks the gods will not find him. In these locations, Unico, having no memory of his past life, wanders these locales and befriends the various colorful denizens within. From Beazle, the young demon who's just as selfish as he is lonely,
こうやっておしゃべりしたり遊んだりしてさ悪口並べたりパタくんならできるぜそうじゃなくてさ
to Katie, an abandoned kitten with aspirations plucked fresh from the fairy tale books.
私断然魔女になっちゃうだって魔法が使えるもん意地悪されてもとっちめてやれるしお魚だって魔法で取れるしさ
Unico, who is innocent, eternally giving, and pure, forms an unbreakable bond with those he meets, helping with their problems and struggles along the way. But the time eventually comes when the gods catch wind of his activities, and the West Wind has to whisk him away from his newfound friends for his safety, lest he be caught by the far less forgiving Night Wind, who is all too willing to do the gods' dark bidding. It's a tragic story of loneliness and the fleeting nature of even the strongest friendships. A lament on life's unfairness and how the good can be punished through machinations beyond their control. A fun-filled adventure for children of all ages. 1981's Fantastic Adventures of Unico is an anime film I was destined to do a video on one of these days. Not only because it's related to a very famous Tezuka joint, but for some Americans, this was one of the first anime films they ever saw. It was really fascinating just seeing how much of a cult following this film has among certain groups of young Gen Xers and elder millennials. It was one of the early examples of Japanese imports in the 80s, mostly thanks to it being a property of a certain company that we'll talk about later. And while I can't find any numbers that suggest it was a hit, it apparently got a lot of rotation on the Disney Channel back when it was a premium movie channel. And yes, I too am old enough to remember those days and the weird movies I saw on there that nobody talks about. Because of that, Unico became a childhood favorite of many children who wouldn't have seen anime like Akira for many years. Yes, what we have right here is a pre-anime boom anime, a precursor to the madness. And before I say anything, I need to make one thing crystal clear. I never saw this movie as a kid. At best, I may have caught a glimpse of the VHS cover, but this was a film that was before my time. There are zero warm childhood memories attached to a single frame of this anime. With that, I have to say, this is a beautiful film. Whoever grew up with this movie, congratulations. You earned the hell out of that nostalgia because this movie is just magnificent. It's been a long time since I watched an animated movie that has given me the same feeling I had as a kid watching something I knew I liked before it was even finished. It's just that good. I don't know what else can be said considering my inner child just gave the Fantastic Adventures of Unico a ringing endorsement, but there are still things I really want to say about this film. I need to tell people what makes Unico such a great movie. People need to know that loving this film is not just nostalgia. Childhood you just had good taste. In the mid-70s, Osamu Tezuka was already settling into the legacy he had built himself within the last 2 decades. Despite pretty much driving his own studio, Mushi Productions, to bankruptcy by investing too much into unmarketable avant-garde features, Tezuka was still pumping out hit manga after hit manga and commanding immense respect from both inside and outside the industry. One company in particular was interested in getting him to do a project for them. That company was Sanrio. Sanrio was currently becoming the brand powerhouse that we know and love today via its effective merchandising of their trademark character, Hello Kitty. By the mid-70s, they were beginning to branch out into animation and manga production. On a visit to Sanrio's Los Angeles studio, Tezuka was given an offer by the company to help create a story for the launch of their new shoujo magazine, Lyrica. Tezuka was hesitant at first because, although he had created shoujo manga in the past, it had been a while since he had last done one. But then, he was struck by sudden inspiration. He asked for a piece of paper and quickly sketched out an idea for the manga's central character, a little unicorn. Upon flying back to Japan, Tezuka named his little creation Unico. Unico began serialization in Lyrica on November of 1976. The manga was incredibly unique to its contemporaries. It was printed in full color, utilized the Western read right to left format, and had the stylistic choice of having its artwork continue outside the panel's borders. The story begins in ancient Greece with Unico as the pet of a young girl of unmatched beauty named Psyche. She is so beautiful that the goddess of love Venus grows jealous of her, and seeing that Unico is the source of Psyche's happiness, plots to do away with him. After luring him away from an ancient Greece best pets competition, no really, Venus kidnaps Unico and orders the West Wind to take him to the Hill of Oblivion. Unable to deny a request from a god, the West Wind obeys and takes Unico away from Psyche, all while removing all memories of her. The story then takes an episodic approach where Unico is set down in one world, befriends some dwellers of that world, and tries to help solve their problem by granting their most needed wish. This usually ends up alerting Venus to Unico's presence, which results in the West Wind spiriting him away to another world. Though this spares him from Venus's wrath, it will always remove the memories he will have of the friends he had just made. Thus, the cycle can begin for all eternity. Despite the story being marketed mostly to preteen girls, Tezuka was unafraid to really tackle difficult subject matters in Unico's stories. The first story, after Unico gets taken away from Psyche, is him getting involved between a star-crossed romance between a Native American boy and a white settler girl. Unico was a successful manga, and the character really did fit within Sanrio's house style to make him a marketable character. But Tezuka was unsatisfied with the comic. He had felt that he made Unico too much of an innocent, too perfect to really be a compelling protagonist. I faced one problem which bothered me after starting the serialization on Lyrica. Unico was too cute. Main characters of today's manga must be evil. They are not attractive if they are too good. On the other hand, Unico is too innocent. Therefore, I had to let other characters have strong personalities. Still, Sanrio knew a hit when they had one and was ready to ride that gravy train for all it was worth. In 1979, the same year the original manga ended its run, Sanrio commissioned the studio Madhouse to create a pilot film for a potential Unico TV anime. Airing as a TV special, the anime follows the manga very closely with utilizing the Psychus Venus plot setup, which turns into an adaptation of the story Black Cloud, White Feather, the story where Unico rescues a sickly young girl from a pollution-spewing factory that engulfs an entire town. Although they do take out the plot thread of that same factory being run by a sentient computer who tries to force the girl to marry it. Yeah, that's Tezuka for ya. But for some reason, networks weren't really biting with the pilot film, so Sanrio shelved a future theatrical release and went back to the drawing board. The solution was that if it was not going to be a TV series, they should just give Unico a feature-length motion picture with a good budget to boot, all while utilizing some of the same Madhouse staff from the pilot film. This included director Toshio Hirata, cinematographer Iwao Yamaki, and Osamu Tezuka himself providing supervision. And if you are privy to his reputation as a huge control freak, you can easily infer that Tezuka probably had a lot more influence on the final product than the credits let on. Visually, if I were to compare the Fantastic Adventures of Unico to anything, it would be a Disney film. And I'm not talking about a modern day Disney movie, I'm talking about a classic Disney movie. The kind brimming with fairy tale magic and an undercurrent of darkness to make the bright spots feel even brighter. Unico is seriously one of the movies Don Bluth is kicking himself for not thinking of it first. The backdrops and setting can range from lush European forests to solitary stone islands in the middle of the ocean, but they all have this sense of magic that surround him. This can all be credited to art director Kazuo Oga. You can really see the work done here being a straight shot to the work he will soon do at Ghibli in a couple of years. That really does speak to why this film is so visually entrancing. It was animated by the top dogs at Madhouse, who were now really coming into their own with these kinds of big budget projects. No character in Unico is animated cheaply. Animation director Akio Sugino made sure each are given lavish character animations that fit their personality without being distracting. I really like how Beazle is always moving like an old cartoon that really sells him as this little gremlin, most of which is done by Yoshiaki Kawajiri, showing us his range of talent before his full commitment to stylized realism. But if you do want a sneak peek at his future oeuvre, then really take a good long look at the film's climax when Unico fights off against the villain Baron Ghost in his fully powered demon form. This is what I mean by Unico having the look and feel of a classic Disney movie. This is anime's own Night on Bald Mountain. Another important key animator in helping Unico give its golden age feel is Matabu Ohashi, a veteran of the industry who's been there since the very beginning. Ohashi really specializes in this storybook illustration style of animation. Thin lines, comical yet subtle character quirks, hand-drawn effects animations that feel lifted out of a picture book. See his work on Robot Carnival for another example. Ohashi's style of animation really brings that childlike wonder that is super important to making Unico work, especially in the super happy and trippy song segment, Katie the Kitty Witch. Easily one of my favorite parts of the film, especially with how he and the staff easily mix and match mediums just to give it that special touch.
There are all kinds of cats, some are wicked, some are good, and I know more magic than a good cat should. Wave your arms and shout, you won't scare me away. I'll do what I want to you anyway.
With all these comparisons to the best of Disney, it does make me wonder exactly how much involvement Tezuka had, especially considering how much of an influence Walt Disney and his animators were to his work. But I guess Sanrio themselves thought of it as their own Disney movie. After all, they did spearhead for an English dub on this. The Fantastic Adventures of Unico might be one of the first serious efforts by a Japanese studio to have one of their films break through to American audiences. As such, it was given an English dub right out of the gate, and you know that's just begging for a comparison. The original Japanese is, of course, really good on its own. Katsue Miwa does an excellent job in bringing the character of Unico to life, playing him like an innocent child, which in turn makes you really feel for him in his more vulnerable moments. Beazle, here named Akuma-kun, is played wonderfully by Junko Hori, whose specialty is young mischievous characters.
2人で静かにお話しするだとかくれんぼ
Katie, here named Chow, is played by Kazuko Sugiyama, who also specializes in little gremlins as well as rebellious young girls, qualities that mix well with the character on top of Sugiyama giving her that slight meow sound to her vocals.
魔女に会いたいなんていうくせに弱虫だな。弱虫なんかじゃないわ。レディはこんな時男の人を頼るのが礼儀なんだもん。
And I have to give big props to Makio Inoi's performance as Baron Ghost and allowing audiences to experience the voice of Goemon Ishikawa coming out of a pure villain.
せいぜい今のうちに幸せな夢でも見るが。
But the voice that ties everything together is folk singer Iruka as the main narrator. Her voice reminds you of a mother reading a bedtime story, which just adds to the film in the best way.
こうして人々は誰もが幸せに暮らせるようになったのです。ところがこれを知った神様たちが大慌て。
But the dub, I find myself really fascinated by. It's such an early example of dubbing with all the baggage that comes with it, like lip flaps necessitating awkward line readings.
I get it now. You never really wanted to be friends. It was all a bunch of hooey.
But in spite of all that, it still captures the spirit of the original Japanese, and I think that's because it's done by a talented director and localizer of the early dubbing scene, Ardwright Chamberlain. Fun fact, he's the voice of Baron Ghost in this anime, and he also did the voice of Goemon in the Mystery of Mamo Streamline dub. That's a casting gag for exactly 12 people.
And see that you tell no one of this. I forbid it.
Alright.
Barbara Goodson makes Unico into a total button with her voice work.
Really and truly and truly and truly?
Yeah, just like I said. Really and truly and truly and true. I think I lost count somewhere. Anyway, I mean what I say!
This was one of her first roles as a voice actress, and she really nails it, ensuring her a long career of voicing young boy characters in anime, and Rita Repulsa.
After 10,000 years, I'm free!
We also have Cheryl Chase voicing Beazle, perfect casting in retrospect considering that she would go on to voice Angelica years later.
Todd! Whoa! Suffering Satan. I almost forgot the ocean's dangerous to us devils.
And Joan Carroll O'Connell still carries that same motherly warmth to the narration and songs that Iruka had.
Long, long ago, in a meadow far, far away, a mother unicorn gave birth to her babies, just as mother unicorns had been doing since the beginning of time.
And since I gave you that knowledge of O'Connell's sweet motherly voice, I'm gonna ruin that with another role she did years later.
Her sting is most deadly.
So really, there's a little difference between the vocal performances in both the sub and the dub. They both do the job in making the stories of Unico and his friends feel compelling, and that's what really matters. Unico's strength as a manga was its episodic format that it used to tell a range of short stories involving the tiny unicorn. So it raises the question of how do you adapt a story with that kind of structure into a 90-minute feature? First thing the film does in answering that question is that it removes the overarching plot of Psyche and Venus in favor of a story of Unico being a little unicorn who's hated by the gods for petty reasons. Which I think is a good call because the Psyche-Venus plotline is never wrapped up in the manga proper, aside from an off-screen explanation that Venus does feel some sort of guilt for what she did at the very end. The film also does a smart thing by adding the character of the Night Wind. Her presence helps raise the stakes and also justifies why the West Wind needs to take Unico away from the New Worlds.
どこにも行きたくないよ。
なりません。神々によって見つかまれば、あなたはもっと辛いところへ捨てられてしまいます。
But even with these changes, it's easy to think that stretching out just one of Unico's many short stories out to 90 minutes would seem untenable. An hour maybe, but 90 minutes is just asking for trouble. And I think the staff of Unico knew this because not only did they opt to adapt two of Unico's stories, Unico in Solitude and The Cat on the Broomstick, but they actually decided to combine them into one story. The stories they chose were both good choices to combine into one extended story because they share similar themes of Unico befriending two small creatures and granting their heart's desire while teaching them an important lesson and making them better people. Both Beazle and Katie are more flawed characters than Unico that are defined by their selfish desires. Beazle has spent most of his life alone on the Hill of Oblivion as the Demon of Solitude and only has the lessons of his late father to go on for knowledge. this has given him a very warped, selfish idea of friendship. When Unico gives him his own horn in exchange for his friendship, he treats Unico like his own personal plaything since he believes friendship should only benefit him. It's only when Unico needs rescuing that Beezle realizes that friendship is a two-way street and rescues him at his own expense. Katie, meanwhile, is an abandoned kitten who has the desire to become a witch, most of which is for petty reasons.
If anybody made me angry, I'd just zap them!
But ultimately is because she wishes to become a human girl just so she can never get abandoned again. Later, when Unico and Katie come across an old woman who lives by herself, the kitten jumps to the conclusion that she must be a witch. Unico decides to go behind Katie's back and transform her into a human girl without her knowledge. Katie thinks that it's the old woman's doing and decides to help her around the house just so she can get taught magic, completely unaware that the old woman is exactly that, just an old woman. Eventually, Katie decides to shirk her duties, leaving the feeble old woman back to do most of her work. This causes Unico to reveal that he was the one behind the spell and that he turns Katie back into a cat as punishment for her selfishness. At first, Katie stews like the petulant kitty cat she is, but then she sees how much the old woman struggles to do daily chores and realizes that she needs to help the old woman regardless of whether or not she gets taught witchcraft in the end. It ends with Unico giving Katie her human form back once she selflessly rescues the old woman from drowning. And don't you think it has escaped me that both of these character journeys are resolved with a water rescue? So yeah, Unico helps other fellow little guys learn a lesson about helping others and in turn makes them better little guys. But we still have half a movie left. What else do we do? Well, the cat on the broomstick plot continues with the introduction of the movie's main villain, Baron Ghost, a dark evil overlord who lives deep within the forest and has mysterious dark powers that causes the woodland creatures to turn violent. In the manga, he was just your average aristocrat who regularly practiced animal cruelty on the animals of the forest, made worse by the fact that he could actually talk to them and still callously kill them. And I think he works kinda better as a villain there because he's far more of an evil you-know than the mysterious demon lord he is here. Although both do manage to lure unsuspecting Katie to their mansion, and I do love how the anime handles the scene by making it clear that the deeper she goes into the forest, the more ensnared she becomes in his trance. Once again, more proof that Tezuka finally is getting to make the Disney movie he always wanted to make. Although, even in the 40s, I doubt Walt and his team would allow the presence of implied date rape to be in their animated features.
Call the police.
And while in the manga, Unico defeats the Baron by turning all the woodland creatures temporarily into humans so that they can effectively ride his ass out of the forest on a rail, the movie opts for the aforementioned Night on Bald Mountain climax, which I do think is better from a more cinematic viewpoint. It's also the moment when the two stories are connected by Beezle hitching a ride with the West Wind, and once again rescuing Unico by giving him his own horn again to revive his powers, thus defeating Baron Ghost and dragging him back to the depths of hell where he belongs. Children's picture, folks. All in all, it's probably the best the team at Madhouse could adapt the story of Unico into a full-length movie. Weld two stories with similar themes together to form a cohesive whole, and have it be centered around an earth-shaking climax. But I feel like the real accomplishment in this movie is hidden deep within its micro. So remember what Tezuka said about Unico, how he found the character difficult to write because of how goody two-shoes and innocent he was? Well, I'm gonna make a bold statement and say that the Fantastic Adventures of Unico kinda solves that problem. In the original manga, you can really feel Tezuka's frustration when dealing with Unico. Despite being the main character in his own title, he really feels like, at best, a foil to the more flawed characters he meets on his journeys, or at worst, a living plot device. And it's not like that's untrue in the movie either. There are definitely quite a few scenes where it feels like Katie's the protagonist instead of Unico. But the Fantastic Adventures of Unico really does benefit from the medium of film. In the comic, the audience spending alone time with Unico can only last a couple of panels. But in the movie, it can last more than a few minutes, and that's enough time to really drive home an important fact that the manga doesn't really dwell on. That Unico is just a little kid forced into an undeserving fate by a group of omnipotent petty assholes, and he doesn't understand it one bit. This gets compounded by his one true desire of having friends because he just does not want to be alone. Once he makes those friends, Unico will always feel compelled to make them happy, all just because he loves them and they will love him back.
僕はね、誰かが僕を愛してくれれば、その人を助ける力が出せんのさ。君は僕を愛してくれたんだ。
But this will always result in the gods detecting his presence, forcing the West Wind to tear him away from his new friends, ultimately forgetting them. Unico being forced to forget everything from the previous world every time he's transported to a new world is not just a convenient tool to keep the story from being a lot heavier than it actually is. Tezuka went on record in describing that Unico's plight is a lot like the cycle of reincarnation. Each world that Unico is plopped down in symbolizes a new life to live, and every time he is taken away from the world by the West Wind, that's just the symbol for the cycle of death and rebirth to begin anew. I get that theming from the manga, but in the anime, it feels a lot more different. Way more tragic, actually. I think Unico's journey being symbolic of life is still there, but it's less reincarnation and more of the events of life. Namely, it speaks to the idea that all life is made up of various meetings and partings. As much of an attachment Unico has to his friends and they in kind, they eventually will have to part ways unexpectedly. It reflects how even the strongest friendships you have are ultimately temporary in life. Friends can disappear just as quick as they can appear. Within the movie, they acknowledge an extra layer of tragedy to it. Bezel and Katie will remember Unico's friendship for as long as they live, but Unico will always be destined to forget them. It's a heavy theme to dwell on in your children's movie. It's that kind of theming that gives the Fantastic Adventures of Unico its quality. As I said before, we can't know for certain just how much involvement Tezuka had in the final product. But even then, it still manages to be covered in his fingerprints. A film with cute characters, songs, and magical settings that somehow mixes well with a dark conflict and real tearjerker theming. Fantastic Adventures of Unico stands as a point in the past to where children's media could have gone, something that could have easily taken up the mantle of the Disney movies of old. If anything, it's a movie that relishes in the childlike wonder of magic and how it can easily bring happiness just as well as it can sorrow. Fate truly hands down its toughest journeys to the littlest guys.